Welcome to chapter 6. Oops, I disappeared. Hold on, let me bring myself back. Gotta make sure I hit the float. There we go. That way you can see my face while I talk about bones and bone structure. It's kind of a longer chapter. I'm gonna divide it into 3. Let's try 3. Let's go for 3. Distinct videos. This will be pretty much Chapter 5, Chapter 6 will be on the next exam because 7, 8, and 9 is actually anatomy questions. So that'll be the lecture or the lab practical part. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We are going to talk about bones. First of all, let's talk about your skeletal system. All right, we divide the skeletal system into 2 distinct components. The first one is called the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is going to include your skull, your vertebral column, and your ribs. Okay, so just the skull, just the vertebral column, and just the ribs. Make sure, let me pull out my little laser pointer. Make sure you understand that when we talk about the spinal column, we actually go down into the sacrum and the coccyx. A lot of people miss this on the practical, even though I'm not talking about what's on the practical yet. And they think that the pelvis is going to be part of the axial, and it's not. It's everything. Think of the axis, the midline axis of the body, and it's everything that is going to be in the middle of the body. Okay? And then you have what's called the appendicular skeleton, and the appendicular skeleton is going to comprise your appendages and everything that's attached to the appendages. So we've got like the clavicle up here, the scapula, your humerus, radia ulna, your pelvis, excuse me, and then obviously you're going to have all of the bones in the leg, and the foot, and the hand. It's also going to make up the associated cartilages that are associated with the joints in the specific regions, and the ligaments and the other connective tissues. So the function of the skeletal system is to provide support. You're sitting there, you're looking at me, and you are able to hold yourself upright. You have 2 different organ systems working together. You have the muscular system that is pulling on your bones to give you posture, and then you have your actual bones, the skeletal system, that is providing protection in your ribs and everything like that. So support. The other thing is it's going to store minerals, and it also stores lipids. We're going to talk about yellow marrow, and yellow marrow is yellow because it's like fatty tissue. We talk about when we're little, we were all indoctrinated, right, by the milk corporation that we needed milk and cheese for healthy bones. You need the calcium for healthy bones. And it's true, you do need calcium for healthy bones. However, your calcium actually has a function as a secondary messenger for all kinds of cool organ systems in the body. And your bones technically act as like a piggy bank for that calcium. And we'll talk about how that happens probably, I think, in 3 videos. It also is going to produce all of your blood cells. All of the blood cells that are flowing in your body right now, all over, are all made in the marrow of your bones, in the red marrow. We know it's going to act as protection, and then we also know that it acts as leverage for muscles and contractions and things like that. So right now, you should be able to tell me what is the axial skeleton and the bones that make up the axial skeleton, and what is the appendicular skeleton. And then you should also be able to tell me the functions of the skeletal system. Write that down. It's on the test. All right. Y'all asked for it, so I'll be throwing this in here. All right, so let's talk about the different types of bones, because we classify things. I got to move my big old head. Hold on. That's better. All right, there's different types of bones, and we categorize them based on their shape. First one we're going to talk about are these, which are called flat bones. Flat bones, if you think about when you were playing with the skull, and I don't know if y'all were annoyed by me or you felt like you were learning from me when I was saying, you know, point to this and I go, this is the frontal bone, this is the frontal bone, this is the frontal bone. Those are flat bones, okay? So pretty much the definition of a flat bone is going to be something where it is flatter than it is, it's thinner than it is wide. We have these that are called sutural bones. Sutural bones are kind of rare. Right here, we learned in lab that this was the lambdoidal suture. And right here, we have a small little bone that is embedded in between the parietal bone and the occipital bone. This would be called a sutural bone. Then we have long bones, and long bones are the bones you think about the most, right? When you're gnawing on a chicken wing. Ironically, I just had drumsticks for dinner. So when I was eating my chicken wing, I was gnawing on a long bone. Long bone, by definition, is going to be longer than it is wider. Irregular bones are just like they sound. They have an irregular shape. They don't really fit into a category. Sesamoid bone, just think patella of the knee. It's going to... The dimensions are odd. I just remember it's the patella. And then you've got short bones. Short bones are going to be the ones that make up the wrist, the carpals, and then you have the carpals, and then you have the tarsals down in the foot. Excuse me. So let's talk about flat bones. The example that I gave you was, let me move my head out the way. The example that I gave you, as I said before, is going to be the bones of the skull, right? They're going to be thin. They're going to have roughly parallel surface. I mean, they can have a little bit of a curvature to them. Examples of flat bones. Yes, you need to know. Make flashcards. Cranial bones are flat bones. The sternum is a flat bone. Your ribs seem like they would be long bones, but they're actually flat. And this is what kind of stinks, because I won't see you again. Oh, I think I'll see you next week. And we'll play with the skeleton some more. And you'll be able to see that the ribs, even though they kind of feel like long bones and look like long bones, when you touch them, they're actually flat. And then your scapula back here, those would be flat bones. They are going to function to protect underlying soft tissues, because obviously brain is soft tissue. We have our lungs, and our chest is soft tissue, but it also adds as an attachment site for muscles, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Sutural bones, like I said before, these are also called wormian bones, and you have a sutural bone right here in the back of your head. These are irregular bones that are formed between the cranial bones, and the number, size, and shape can vary from person to person. Long bones, like I just talked about. Think of, what is it? Chicken wing, hot dog and bologna. You know that song from TikTok? If you don't, then you're lame. Anyway, chicken wing, the wings, your radius, your ulna, those would be long bones. Your humerus would be a long bone. Your femur is a long bone. Definition is they're going to be relatively long and slender. Most of the bones in your limbs are going to be long bones. Your fingers are going to be long bones as well, because the bones are actually longer than they are wider. Irregular bones are just like they sound. They are going to have all kinds of crazy shapes. They're kind of usually short. They're flat. They're notched. They have ridged surfaces. And example of this would be your vertebra. I mean, if I was describing to someone who was visually impaired the shape of individual vertebra, that'd be really hard, right? You'd be like, okay, well, it's round, and then it has these things that come off, and then you have these little wings, and then you have a little spine, and then you have a middle. Yeah, if it takes several words to describe the bone, it's probably going to be an irregular bone. The bones of the pelvis would be considered irregular, and so would your facial bones, like the zygomatic bone. Obviously, that's an oddly shaped. Your mandible would be an irregular bone. The maxilla is a regular bone. The sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, these are all going to be irregular. Sesamoid bones are going to be small, they are flat, and they are shaped like a sesame seed. I've never really gotten that close to a sesame seed, so I can't really tell you if they actually are the shape of a sesame seed, but everybody says they are, hence why they're called sesamoid bones. They develop inside the tendons in your knee, your hands, and the feet. And I'm still not sure which ones are there, because honestly, I'm a physiologist. The bone thing, I'm good at the big ones, but the individual little ones, that's when I call on Rowdy. Short bones are going to be the things like in your wrist and your ankles. They're small, they're boxy. Again, the carpals are your wrist bones, and the tarsals would be your ankle bones. Okay, so this is putting it all together. You see the sutural bone here, irregular bone here, short bones here, sesamoid here, long, and then flat bones. Now, here is where it's funny, because when everybody comes into anatomy, they get so scared, and they're asking, are you going to make us memorize all the bones in the body? And I'm like, yeah. And honestly, memorizing the bones is not the hard part. It's memorizing the markings that are found on each bone where it gets a little bit more challenging. Bone markings are also called surface features, and they are related to particular functions. You have elevations and projections, and usually these are going to be parts where you have a muscle, a tendon, or some type of ligament is attached to it. These are also going to occur wherever you you see joints that articulate with each other. That's a fancy, this is articulation, like, okay? You also see depressions, grooves, and little tunnels in bones. And these are going to be sites where the blood vessels go in and the nerves go in, and they can lie alongside the bone and penetrate deep into the bone, which will make more sense in the last video when I talk about the way the blood vessels go in and the way they create blood and dump the blood into those vessels. Certain bone markings that are general. So we look at the femur. Up here, this is called the head of the femur, okay? So this is where I would reiterate what I talked about in class to help you get good at anatomy. This is the head of the femur. 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 The head is usually going to be at the proximal end of a bone, and it's going to form part of a joint that we call a ball and socket joint, all right? The next thing that most people are aware of at the bone is called the diaphysis. The diaphysis is going to be the main shaft of the bone, and then you also have something called the neck, and the neck is the connection that's going to occur between the head and the diaphysis. So if I know this is the head and this is the neck, the part that connects them, this is the head, this is the diaphysis, the part that connects them is called the neck. So head of the femur, this is the neck 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 of the femur. Now up here, this is called the greater trochanter, and then down here is called the lesser trochanter, and we'll talk about that more when we get to anatomy. All right. More bony markings. A process is any projection or bump that is on a bone, okay? It's a generic term, okay? We say like it has a bony process. We have another word that's called a tubercle, and a tubercle is what you see like right here. This is some type of small and rounded projection. Then you have something called a tuberosity, and a tuberosity is going to be small, it's rough, and it takes up a broader area. You have one on your humerus that's called your deltoid tuberosity, and that's going to be where, you know, obviously the deltoid muscle is going to insert. The trochlea is a smooth, grooved, articular process that is shaped like a pulley. So down here on the distal part of the humerus, you see what is called a trochlea. And then we have what's called a condyle, and the condyle is going to be the smooth, rounded, articular process. Okay? So this is the whole thing is called the condyle, and then this little part here and this part here is called the trochlea. All right, we already talked about the trochanter up here of the femur. This is called the greater trochanter. And the greater trochanter of the femur is a large, rough projection. We also have something called a facet, and a facet is going to be small, it's flat, and it's going to be an articulating surface. So this is where the patella would kind of articulate with the distal end of the femur. Okay, let's talk about more bony markings. A crest is a prominent ridge. So up here, we see this. This is called the crest of the pelvis. And then we have a line, and a line is a low ridge that is more delicate than a crest. So here we see, here is a line of the pelvis. A spine is a pointed or a narrow process, and you see this little thing here, this is the spine that is found on the pelvis. And then a ramus is an extension of a bone that makes an angle with the rest of the structure. So this is considered the ramus. Alrighty. A canal or a meatus, we already learned about the external acoustic meatus when we were playing with the skull in lab, is a large passageway through a bone. A sinus is going to be like a hollow chamber within a bone, and it's normally going to be filled with air, unless you get a sinus infection that gets, you know, mucus and grossness. And then do not confuse a canal or a meatus with a foramen. A foramen is going to be a small, rounded passageway in which blood vessels, nerves pass through the bone, and there's a lot of them we're going to learn in the skull. Okay. Moving on, we've got a fissure, and a fissure is an elongated cleft or gap. So back here in the back of the eye socket, we have something called a fissure. A sulcus is going to be a deep, narrow groove. So right here, can we see a sulcus on here? I do not see the sulcus. Why don't they have it labeled here? Sulcus. Central sulcus we'll talk about when we get to the brain. Leave it at that. Fossa is going to be a shallow depression or recess in the bone. So it'll make more sense when I can move the skull. Okay. So one of the big things is I do not test on the names of those, just so you know. I introduce them because you're going to need to know specific markings on the bone, but I promise you on the test I will never ask you, what is the definition of a sulcus? What is the definition of a fissure? None of those things. I really don't care if you can define them. I need you to be able to use them in context. So right now you should be able to explain the 6 categories of bones and how do we classify them. Define what a bone marking is and just be familiar. I don't care if you list them. I don't care if you know the definition. There are things like a tuberosity versus a tubercle versus a condyle versus a trochanter. But even that, honestly, it's more important that you know the context when we're looking at the bone. All right. Are we good? Moving on. All right, so now let's talk about the long bones. We're going to focus with the long bones, and they're called long because they are longer than they are wide. Oops. And when we think of bones and we think of skeletons, that's usually what we focus on is like the arms and the legs. So long bone features, we have this region up here that is called the epiphysis. And the epiphysis is the expanded area at each end of the bone. So you have an epiphysis here at the proximal end of the femur, and then you have an epiphysis here at the distal end of the femur. Okay? It's going to consist of what we call spongy bone. It's called spongy bone because when you cross it, it looks like a cross-section of it. It actually looks like sponge. The fancy name is called trabecular bone. The outer covering of it is going to be compact bone, and I'll talk about what the difference is between the two. Compact bone is more strong. It's more like cement. And then it's also going to have articulating cartilage that covers the ends of the epiphysis because this is where joints form, and you want to have cartilage because it has a smooth surface. All right, now, I would say, depending on which end of the bone you're looking at, it could either be proximal or distal to the epiphysis, is something called the metaphysis, or metaphysis, depending on who's teaching the course. I never pronounce it right. That is going to be the part where the epiphysis is going to connect to the diaphysis, okay? The diaphysis is going to be the shaft of the bone. And it's what you think of if you've ever broken a chicken bone or something like that and you see the marrow inside. This is going to be where the majority of the marrow is. And there's 2 different types of marrow, okay? There's red marrow, and the red marrow is going to be involved in blood cell production. And then you have the yellow marrow, which is going to be adipose tissue, and it acts as an energy reserve. The interesting thing is yellow marrow can become red marrow. Okay. So how does all of this grow and how does it maintain life? It has to have a blood supply, okay? So even though we think of hard, almost robotic type structures, it is highly innervated with blood vessels that are going into the bone and coming out of the bone. Way back when I took anatomy in 1900, we were told that it was just blood vessels that went in and out. We were told there was no nerve supply. And I remember there was a girl in the front of the lecture hall, and she's like, well, I'm a gymnast, and I've broken bones, and it hurts really, really bad. What causes it to hurt? And we were told way back when that there's something called the periosteum. It's connective tissue that surrounds the bone, and it's highly innervated with nerves. Now, when I went into graduate school, we were even told that. And then now we're finding out that we're like, no, there really are nerves that go in there. Anyway, let's talk about the blood vessels for now that I've had this weird tangent. We have something called the nutrient artery and the nutrient vein. All right, and this is going to be, you get 1 per bone. And it's going to enter in this little hole in the bone called the nutrient foramen. So remember, when you think of foramen, you think of a hole in the bone and a blood vessel goes through it. Okay? So as you can see here, we've got an artery, and if you don't know, artery, for the most part, is going to carry oxygen-rich blood. There are exceptions. So we have all of these cells that are living in their lacunae that we need to provide nutrients to. We're also making blood in the marrow, so we got to have a way to get it out of the bone. Anyway, so we've got this blood supply going in, and then we have blood supply coming out, which would be the nutrient vein. The metaphyseal artery and the metaphyseal vein is what you are going to see up or down here. So you can see here it's going to enter at the metaphysis. So right here, and then you also have the epiphyseal artery and vein. So you have this metaphyseal artery and vein is going to enter, and then it's going to bifurcate and go up into the epiphysis, and then that is now called the epiphyseal artery and vein. Okay, and then you can see here on the head, you have the articulating cartilage. Okay, so the nutrient artery and vein is going to go through the main part of the bone marrow. And then at each end of the bone, you're going to have the metaphyseal artery and vein that are going to go in through the metaphyses on both ends. And they're going to bifurcate and go up into the epiphysis. And then it's going to be called the epiphyseal artery and vein. Okay? All right. So we also mentioned in my little sidetrack story that there is connective tissue that covers the bone. And this connective tissue is called the periosteum. Okay, whenever you see peri, think of around. Osteo means bone, so it means around the bone. So this connective tissue called the periosteum is also going to be highly innervated because it's connective tissue. So remember I said connective tissue is highly vascular. So it has all of these little blood vessels in it. And they're going to supply what we call the superficial osteons with their blood supply. They also have lymphatic vessels that are going to collect the lymph from the bones and the osteons, and they also contain those sensory nerve fibers that we were told were the only nerves that innervate the bone. The sensory nerves are going to innervate at the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, and the epiphyses as well. And as you can see here, what we're talking is the yellow, I can't even think of my colors, it's Saturday night. The yellow is what's describing as the nerve. And as you can see, I was flat out lied to and told wrong when I was an undergrad and even in the beginning of grad school because we were told that it only had a nerve supply here. But as you can see, what happened was the nerve actually went into the medullary cavity and then it went up and it actually goes into the bone and then comes out here into the periosteum. Pretty cool, right? Dr. McConnell, she lied to me. It's weird that I remember her name. Anyway, so at this point of the video, you should be able to describe the major parts of the long bone. You should be able to tell me what is the function of the medullary cavity. You should be able to tell me where you find articulating cartilage and how is it nourished. And you should also be able to tell me why bone injuries are painful. It's weird that I told you that story. It's kind of like I knew this question was coming. And I'll probably put it on the test to make sure you paid attention in the video. Okay, let's talk about cellular physiology. Well, I moved this out of the way. Just remember that the word that is there. Bones have what we call a calcified matrix, all right? Calcified meaning it involves calcium, and it's going to be hard, okay? The calcified matrix actually continuously gets broken down and rebuilt by a variety of different cells. Think of this. Osteoblast means to build. Cyte means I'm old. Clast means I break it down. Okay? And this will make more sense as I go through this. First thing we want to talk about is something called an osteogenic cell. They're also called osteoprogenitor cells. Osteo means bone, genic means to create. So let's talk about how all of this originates. We have these cells that some people call mesenchymal cells, others call mesenchymal cells, and these are connective tissue stem cells that are actually going to differentiate. And remember, differentiate means a cell that is immature and then it decides on a fate because genes turn on and genes turn off. So mesenchymal cells are going to differentiate into these cells called osteoblasts. And remember I said osteoblast means to build. So these osteoblasts are going to build the bony matrix. Osteogenic cells are important because they repair fractures, and where they're found are going to be on the inside of the periosteum, and remember the periosteum is the connective tissue that surrounds the bone. It's going to line the inside of the medullary cavity, and that lining on the inside of the medullary cavity is not called the periosteum, it's called the endosteum. En means inside. And it's also going to line passageways wherever you see blood vessels going into and out of the cell. So, now we're talking about an osteoblast, and I said osteoblast means to build. So, osteoblasts are going to secrete a substance that we call the bony matrix. first thing it does is it creates this substance called osteoid. And osteoid is when the minerals have not deposited yet. So it's really, really rich in collagen, but and other proteins too, but it hasn't gotten hard yet. It's kind of like laying down the rebarb before you lay down the cement, okay? So it's going to assist in the deposition of the calcium to convert the osteoid into what we call hard bone. Now, when an osteoblast completely surrounds itself into that lacunae, okay, we now call it an osteocyte, okay? So, like I said before, an osteocyte is what you see in the lacunae. So here's the lacunae here, and these little canals that connect this lacunae to this lacunae are called canaliculi. So an osteocyte is a mature bone cell, and it can't divide anymore. And it's going to maintain the protein and the mineral content of the surrounding bony matrix. So it kind of just sits there. The osteoblast builds, and it builds and builds and builds, and it surrounds itself in this matrix, and it kind of gets trapped in there. It's like, oh crap, where do I go now? Well, I can't really do anything. I'm just going to sit here and make sure all of this maintains and stays hard. We've already said that it occupies that little lake called the lacunae, and it's separated by layers of matrix that we call lamellae, that I'll see show in a couple slides, and they're connected to each other by the canaliculi. So don't think that this cell's not talking to this cell, because it is, and the way it's doing it is through the canaliculi. Now, the I'm creating my own language. The osteoblast has evil cousin. Not that it's evil, because you want this to happen. But the osteoblast is build, osteoclast is destroy. The whole point of the osteoclast is to remove bone, okay? And this is why your face, I used to be so handsome when I was younger, your face is constantly changing as you get older. I look at pictures of myself and I'm like, what the heck happened to me? I mean, I know I got gray and my hair started falling out, but my facial features change. If you have grandparents or something like that, especially grandparents, look at their bone structure in their face when they're the age that they are now, compare it to the bone structure that they had when they were in their 40s and 50s. I mean, granted, you know, or our 20s, for that matter, sorry. Granted, now we've got the Kardashians that have turned plastic surgery into, like, some type of grooming. But for the most part, your facial features are constantly going to change because of osteoblast building and osteoclast tearing down. And there's lots of different factors that are going to shape the way the bone reshapes as it is being torn down and rebuilt. Okay? So osteoclasts are going to remove and remodel the bone matrix. How they do this is they release acids and other proteolytic enzymes that actually break down the bony matrix, and they'll release that stored minerals back into your bloodstream. So that calcium actually can get taken from your bone and put into the bloodstream. This is a process that we call osteolysis. Remember, lysis means to break. Okay. So let's put this all together on where you would see this. There we go. Okay, so here is the medullary cavity, right? And we see here, we would align it with endosteum. This is the medullary cavity, and you have, again, the osteogenic cell. And the osteogenic cell is a descendant of the mesenchymal cell, and it is going to produce an osteoblast, okay? So it differentiates into the osteoblast, and the osteoblast is going to build bone. And remember, when it surrounds itself by a bony matrix, it can no longer be called an osteoblast. It's kind of trapped in here. It's called an osteocyte. And then you have these things called osteoclasts that are going to break down the bone. And your bone is constantly doing this. Bone is always reshaping depending on the gravitational forces that are pulled upon it. Okay, so let's talk about that bony matrix. In the lab, we didn't really see it last time because I hadn't lectured on this yet. We have some chicken wings. Or actually, no, I think they're drumsticks. And what they did is they put it in acetic acid. And the acetic acid is going to remove all the mineralized components. And we're going to take it out, and you can see what this guy's doing here. Or lady, those look like lady fingers. I don't even know. When you take out the bony matrix, it still maintains its shape, but you can actually, you can bend it. It's flexible. Okay, so collagen is that main rebarb that I was talking about before. It counts for about a third of the weight, and it adds a little bit of flexibility to the bone. Then we have this inorganic molecule here called calcium phosphate, and it's going to make up about 2/3 of the bone weight. What happened was you have this interaction of calcium hydroxide, which is this right here, and it's going to form crystals of something called hydroxyapatite, which is calcium phosphate with the hydroxide, and this is a salt. This incorporates other salts that include calcium carbonate, which is CaCO3, and other ions such as sodium, magnesium, and fluoride. Remember, fluoride for healthy teeth. And the whole point of all of these inorganic compounds is they're going to provide all of the strength you think about when you think about the hardness of a bone. Okay. So at this point of my lecture, think back of all the stuff that I've been rambling about way too quickly. You should be able to tell me the function of the osteogenic cells and what are osteoblasts and what do they do. You should be able to tell me what an osteocyte is and where you would find them. You should also be able to tell me how the compressive strength of a bone would be affected if the ratio of collagen to hydroxyapatite is increased. So more collagen, less hydroxyapatite. And you should also be able to tell me what the osteoclast activity, if the osteoclast activity exceeds that of the osteoblast, what would happen to the bone? Think about that. Okay, moving on. Now let's talk about that thing that I was saying before called compact bone. Compact bone is going to consist of parallel things called osteons, and spongy bone consists of a network of crisscrossing bony crystally things called trabeculae. First, let's talk about the compact bone. That's what you think of when you see. And remind me to show you this in the lab because I had that model. Someone had asked something about when they were looking at the osteons in the microscope and they were looking at the lacunae, I had a model at the front and it had the lacunae in it and it was the compact bone that I was pointing to. Compact bone, the functional unit is called an osteon, and depending on the age of the book, they're also called Haversian systems. They're organized into what we call concentric lamellae, which are like rings upon rings upon rings upon rings, and they are going to be organized what's called a central canal. So let's look here. Here we see the central canal, and here you see a ring around a ring around a ring. So these are the concentric lamellae that I'm talking about. Okay, so the osteocytes, this is, you got to remember, you just see the empty lacuna right there. When the bone was alive, there was an osteocyte in there. So the osteocytes are going to lie in these lacunae, and the lacunae are found in between each ring, which is called the lamellae. And again, here you have the central canal, and the central canal is going to contain the small blood vessels. So you can see them here. You have the blood supply, you have a vein, an artery, and a nerve. Okay. Because that's definitely going to be like, what's in the central canal? You need to know central canal is a hole in the middle that contains a artery, vein, and nerve. And the ring around each one is called the lamellae. All right, so the canaliculi, we already said, are those little black hair-like things that are coming out of the lacunae, and they allow the osteocyte that lives here to communicate with the osteocyte that lives there. It's strong all along the length of the bone. Okay. We've already talked about that the periosteum is that connective tissue that surrounds the bone. Compact bone is always going to be the outer layer. So you have the periosteum, and below that you have the compact bone. And then you have something called the circumferential lamellae, and those are going to be at the outer and the inner surfaces of the bone. And then you have the interstitial lamellae, which are going to fill the spaces in between the osteons. It makes more sense when I show you the picture. Osteons, we already said, they're connected by these perforating canals that are perpendicular to the surface of the bone. And then we have spongy bone at the innermost layer. See, now this is what I was talking about. I need to move. Okay, because you'll probably have this on the homework. Here we have the spongy bone, or trabecular bone, here, yes? And here we have the circumferential lamellae. It goes around the circumference on the outside of the bone and the inside of the bone. Here we have the concentric lamellae. It's going around in a circle. But obviously, if you have a circle on a circle, you have a space in between. See where my lips are? Okay, so that is where you would have the interstitial lamellae here. So this is interstitial lamellae here. So again, where I'm talking now, that's going to be where the interstitial lamellae would be. And here you have the circumference, oh my God, it just went out of my head. The concentric lamellae. There we go. So circumferential lamellae out here, outer circumference, inner circumference, concentric lamellae here, because it's concentric rings, interstitial lamellae here. Remember, there is a central canal that goes up and down in the concentric lamellae that has a nerve, a blood vessel, and a nerve, artery, and a vein. Okay, so this is the central canal. But we also have this central canal is connected to this central canal, and that is called a perforating canal. Okay, so take a moment and say circumferential lamellae, circumferential lamellae, concentric lamellae, concentric lamellae, concentric lamellae. Interstitial means in between. And then we have the central canal, which goes up and down. Perforating canal goes here. Okay? Oops, let me move this stuff out the way. My head. All right, so spongy bone. See how I said it looks like a sponge when you take a cross-section of it? This is what is spongy bone. The lamellae form struts and plates that we call trabeculae, and they create an open network. You're not going to find blood vessels in the matrix here. The nutrients reach the osteons through the canaliculi, and they open to the trabecular surface. So here you see what we have are trabeculae of the spongy bone. But you can see that you have these canaliculi, the little holes, that open onto the surface. They're going to be lined with endosteum around the outer edges, okay, because remember this is the inside of the bone. So the periosteum would be out here, the endosteum is going to be here, and it covers all of these trabeculae. And when we do a cross-section look, you can see that the lamellae are going to be here, right? So this would be concentric lamellae because it's ring. Red marrow is found in between all of this. So right here, you don't see red marrow because all the red marrow has been drained out. You only see the bony matrix that was left behind. But normally this would have been filled with the red marrow and then the endosteum and then the trabeculae are what are you seeing behind. Okay. Now, okay. So you should be able to tell me at this point what an osteon is. You should be able to compare and contrast compact bone and spongy bone, and you should be able to talk about the circumferential lamellae, the concentric lamellae, the interstitial lamellae. You should be able to label them all. Central canal, perforating canal, periosteum, and endosteum. You should be able to tell me what all of that stuff is and where it would be located. And I am going to stop the first video here because now we're going to get into how bones grow. Okay, so I will see you all in the next video.